Today we're going to be talking heavy metal subgenres and our favorite heavy metal albums. Hey guys, that music really doesn't fit today's episode. Do you think you could change it up a bit? Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode 25. My name is David Lane. I'm your host. It is great to be with you once again. And this is part 2 of Heavy Metal 101. We're going to be talking today once again with Eric Schwartz. Now, if you didn't hear episode 24, part 1 of this conversation, I think you can still follow along. I don't think there's going to be anything today that you would be behind on. You would get a more complete idea of what we're talking about and also, learn a little bit more about Eric himself and his podcast if you were to go to part 1. But if you're a first-time listener, you can certainly jump right in. We welcome you to check out this episode. I think you'll be able to follow along just fine. Now, if you are a first-time listener, this is not a heavy metal podcast. Just thought I should go ahead and say that. My guest, Eric Schwartz, he has a heavy metal podcast that we talk about called Heavy Metal 101. This is a podcast all about developing your tools as a musician. And one that I find is that great musicians do not pigeonhole themselves into only knowing one or even a couple of genres, but they understand how music works in all of the genres and are able to appreciate and even respect the genre whether or not they actually like the music. I'll be honest with you, there's some music that we're going to talk about today that is not my favorite, but some of the music is. And same thing, I offer some music that my guest doesn't like as much as I do. And that's okay. When we talk about genres, we're not talking about which one is better because of how much you like to listen to it. Because for every type of music that you don't like, there's someone who loves it. And the same goes for music that you love. There's someone that doesn't like it. What we want to talk about here is what makes the music tick. And we're also, of course, besides talking about the genre, we are talking about music history. Music history does not just include labels like Baroque, Classical, and Romantic, and refer to one type of genre in one region of the world. So today we're going to be looking a little bit more broadly at the history, but also looking at it in terms of subgenres. And then we'll be concluding this episode by Eric and myself each offering 5 of our all-time favorite heavy metal albums. So this is fun, and it is chock full of music. 41 examples, if I've counted correctly, just for today's episode alone. So let's get to it. This is my Part 2 conversation about heavy metal with Eric Schwartz. All right, I know that we could take a half hour to an hour to go through all of the metal subgenres. So let's just say, what would you consider the most major subgenres of metal? And maybe give us a representative band or album of each.
Okay. So I kind of have a simplified framework of looking at subgenres, particularly before, once you get through the mid to late 90s, like the family tree goes whoosh, and you start getting basically, every 3 bands has a subgenre. But before that, it's a little bit more straightforward. So obviously heavy metal, I think it's fair to say begins with Black Sabbath. You get a thread from Black Sabbath through Judas Priest, through Iron Maiden that I would call traditional metal. I would call it sort of the center point. If you're going to, heavy metal as a platonic ideal. A perfect album for that would probably be, Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden, 1982. Yeah, amazing album for Bruce Dickinson's first album with the band. And it really, it's classic or traditional metal. at its finest. Now, at the same time, even as early as like the late 70s, the very beginning of the codification or the crystallization of metal, you start to get what I call the first fragmentation. So you have that through line of traditional metal, but then you get in 1978 the eponymous debut of Van Halen. Right. This picks up on a controversial thread of metal. You have Kiss, you have Montrose, you have Aerosmith. You have these bands that are really definitely quite a hard rock with a little theatricality. A lot of people don't like to call those bands heavy metal. I think that by Van Halen, I don't think I have trouble thinking of Van Halen 1, the debut album, as anything other than a pop metal album. Like, it is heavy metal. It's a little less heavy. It's a little more about sex, drugs, rock and roll than it is about, Jack the Ripper and such. But to me, that's where you get the pop metal thread, and the first Van Halen album is, to me, the great masterpiece of the decade. That's not by Black Sabbath, really. And so you get that thread, and then just around the same time, 1977, especially 1979, Motorhead really pioneer the fusion of punk and metal velocity that is going to become speed metal and really, really, really become thrash metal, come Metallica. So that's the sort of speed/thrash subgenre for that. I think the platonic ideal would definitely be Metallica's Master of Puppets, 1986. To me, probably arguably the greatest sort of classic thrash album. And so those are the three principal subgenres, and they kind of serve throughout the 80s, I think, reasonably. Things start to further fragment at the end of that decade, and particularly in the 90s. In the 90s, that's where you start to get the death, I'll put it in air quotes because it's not really true, of all these earlier genres. And then you start to get the more extreme metal subgenres. You get, in the late 80s, you get death metal, the band,
Slayer.
Excuse me?
Slayer, was that, would you count Slayer as death metal?
Slayer were often referred to as death metal by people at the time before that genre had really, that subgenre, I guess, had really crystallized. I think that I consider Slayer a thrash band. They have the chug, they have all the necessaries to be, aesthetically called the thrash band. They're definitely on the periphery. I mean, a band like Sepultura, who come a little bit later, are even more on that periphery, probably going into proto-death metal. For me, the people often say that Possessed's Seven Churches is the first death metal album. I think Death's Scream Bloody Gore is really a better candidate. Uh, 1987, but by 1988, you have Death's Leprosy, the second album by the band Death, and that's really establishing something that clearly is taking more of an influence from bands like Venom and Celtic Frost and sort of more extreme influences, and really pioneering something that's that's X-rated, as we say, that really, really extreme. And then just a couple of years later, you get its sort of eviler twin, I don't know, a reaction to death metal, particularly out of Norway. You get black metal. And black metal is, of course, steeped in a lot of bad things that happen in the Norway of the early 90s. You have church burnings, you have murders, you have this really dark scene. These performers wearing corpse paint, very theatrical, super, super heavy lo-fi music. I would say that probably one of the most interesting of those early black metal, sort of first Norwegian black metal bands, is the band Emperor in the Nightside Eclipse. That's an incredible 1993, just a monumental early black metal. So you have that, and then I guess the only other thread I might chase here, traditional metal really goes kind of, traditional and pop metal have a bad 1990s, definitely, but traditional metal really kind of reemerges as power metal in the 1990s, pioneered by a band like Halloween, Keeper of the Seven Keys. Is really good, sort of early power metal, and thrash metal. You get the Black Album, right? You get Metallica doing the Black Album. You get Megadeth doing Countdown to Extinction. These are not thrash albums in any meaningful way. They're metal, but they're not thrash. And I would say thrash metal kind of becomes Pantera-esque groove metal, which is cool, which is a good thing. And then that is, if we wanted to go further, that's going to eventually beget nu metal, and you with an umlaut, and we're all going to be pissed off about that in the late 90s. And so, you have nu metal, and then the last thread I'll chase down for subgenres is that death metal in Gothenburg, Sweden in the mid 90s starts getting a real melodic aspect, and melodic death metal, bands like At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul. These are really beautifully melodic manifestations of death metal, and that's going to give us this interesting genre called metalcore that takes elements of melodic death metal, elements of hardcore, and that's going to really get us to the 21st century as like the big hip, nu metal and then metalcore as the big hip trends. That's my very, very brief history of subgenres in metal.
Now I'm quite drawn to bands that are called, I've heard them a variety of ways: progressive metal, symphonic metal.
This is where we get to argue.
Yeah. Now I'm not a big fan of this band, but Dream Theater is the first one that I heard this associated with.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, where you put like progressive metal. There's just some bands that I quite enjoy, but I guess where would you say that came from? Is that just like
so everything comes back to Black Sabbath. It always comes back to Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, do they become a progressive metal band? Do they become a progressive not metal band? I mean, over the course of the 1970s, as Black Sabbath develop, you get... Once you start to get to Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage, 73 and 75, you're getting a lot of keyboards. You're getting these much more experimental song forms, weird percussion. And Sabotage, you have this song called Super Czar that's like got a choir and harp and orchestrations. It's quite progressive. And so that thread, which is tied obviously to a lot of what was going on in 1970s progressive rock, which is quite possibly my least favorite genre of music that is in the rock family.
Big difference of opinion here.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna expound upon that. So if I say I'm not a huge fan of that body of work, but I like what Black Sabbath did with it for a while, and then Black Sabbath get into their technical ecstasy phase where they lose a lot of their metal and they lose me as well. So the long story short is that progressive elements in mid 70s rock music definitely filter into heavy metal, and it's something, Iron Maiden have progressive elements. I would say that Judas Priest always, at least until, British Steel and that sort of era in the early 80s, Judas Priest have a lot of progressive elements that I really, really enjoy, actually. I know you and I see eye to eye on the band Queensryche,
Right.
Queensryche are one of my favorite bands.
Mhm.
I don't, their earliest, they had an EP that was kind of very much post Iron Maiden, but their debut full length of Warning, that album is very much a prog metal album that I'm kind of iffy on. But they bring a lot of progressive elements in a really interesting way. So yeah, I mean, I will just simply say I do not enjoy Dream Theater. They're not one of my favorite bands. I'm okay with the Metropolis album. They have their moments,
Right.
but music in general, and this is true of classical music as much as it's true of heavy metal for me. Music that's simply about virtuosity, that where the songs themselves aesthetically don't appeal to me, and
Hmm.
that's me. They lose me. I don't. I'm not that interested in instrumental virtuosity. It's not. It's not really my thing. I do. So progressive bands that I don't love, but are
Yeah.
really important. That are really really important to metal. Opeth.
Right.
Opeth are a very important band. Blackwater Park is my favorite Opeth album. Like really progressive elements of melodic death metal, but also elements of classic and progressive rock. Mastodon.
Right.
Mastodon is a band that brings a whole bunch of elements like sludge, like sort of southern rock metal, grungy elements, but very much a progressive thread as well. Leviathan is one of the great 21st century metal albums. Definitely, it's got a lot of progressive elements. Crack the Sky, gosh, is totally a progressive metal album. And so again, it's not my thing, but yeah, progressive metal is it's an important subgenre. It's one that still exists today. I think Haken, one of my favorite progressive metal bands, they just came out with a new album. I just actually started perusing it the other day. So yeah, progressive metal, which is just the heavy metal version of progressive rock, which to me, I will say, is often but not always as much about as an aesthetic, a
Right.
sound quality, as it is about the idea of being progressive. I mean, the band Pink Floyd falls under a lot of people's progressive rock idea, but they don't sound like Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They don't sound like Rush. They don't sound like a lot. Yes, all those bands I think have a lot of aesthetic language in common that a band like Pink Floyd doesn't fall into. And I'd say the same thing of progressive metal bands that I like a little bit. Tool are very progressive, but they don't sound like progressive metal.
Right. One of the albums that you recommended was Zeal and Ardor, Devil
Oh
is
yeah,
Fine. That was,
yeah.
I listened to a few others that you recommended that I didn't know, and didn't quite have the same positive love, but I had it with that one. So you hear like sounds like some like work music,
Yes. Zeal and Ardor are so freaking cool. I mean, it's really fundamentally a one-man black metal project, which is kind of a common thing in that idiom. The like one dude doing a studio project. His name's Manuel Gagnon. He's half African American and half Swiss, basically his idea was to synthesize metal and sort of traditional African American music from like field hollers and work songs through early blues and whatnot. It's black metal, the sort of that kind of Norwegian satanic early '90s ethos synthesized with African American tradition, and it is awesome. I mean, I really love Zeal and Ardor. Their first album is from 2016. They have a 2022 album as well. I mean, it's a really, really cool project. He's a really fascinating musician. Yeah, I definitely would recommend that. You could call that, I think, progressive for the simple sake that he's doing something that progresses, heavy metal. Brings really to the forefront what has always been in the background. I mean, we talked about classical music. We could spend just as much time talking about the blues as a
Yeah.
foundational influence of heavy metal. And so Gagnon and Zeal and Ardor, that's really like bringing those elements to the forefront of the metal aesthetic. And it's so cool. Yeah. Devil is Fine is a great album to start with.
I'll see a few more questions before we get to our last round. one, is there a place in heavy metal for bands that don't use the traditional instruments? Like, I'm thinking, like, is there any world in which you'd say like Nine Inch Nails or like the Prodigy? You know, some very heavy, distorted electronic bands, or do
Yeah,
they?
so me and my anti-dogma, I have the big tent approach.
Mhm.
So I'm never comfortable excluding. Nine Inch Nails is an interesting case because I am a huge Nine Inch Nails fan. I would say that the Downward Spiral is on my short list of favorite albums of all time. And when you and I discussed like lists of heavy metal albums, I kind of wrestled with whether or not to put that on for this very reason.
Right.
I'm, for me, not 100% certain whether I consider Nine Inch Nails, particularly if you think of like Broken and Downward Spiral, this real sort of guitar-oriented industrial. Ministry, another perfect example.
Right.
Whether or not I consider industrial music as industrial metal, or Nine Inch Nails particularly, or what have you. But I don't see why not. I mean, as early as Pretty Hate Machine, and I go to the teenage Eric who listened only to heavy metal. I remember going to a heavy metal camp, National Guitar Summer Workshop, and I was there, and I was showing off this weirdo Nine Inch Nails debut album that nobody really was familiar with. And I remember showing it in some like music seminar session, and the grizzled old guitarist metal dude teacher was like, yeah, this music's really cool, it sounds so much better if it was a live band with like guitars and stuff. And I was like, you're missing the point, man. But at the same time, I mean, I think that's often going to be the response, especially to something like Pretty Hate Machine, which is sort of pre the distorted guitar elements of the stuff that came immediately after. But I personally am comfortable considering all those things as metal, or at least very nearly metal adjacent. I mean, I think that the code of metal, which took time to crystallize over the 1970s, by the time we get into the 90s, the late 80s even, it's thoroughly crystallized. And once a genre is crystallized, you can mess with it. You can have an album without distorted electric guitar that, can possibly be construed as heavy metal, depending on what else is going on. I mean, it definitely complicates the matter. But yes, I think the long story short is I don't think you need any one fundamental element to be construed as heavy metal. I do think that you need enough elements that there can be some sort of consensus reached. But you're always going to have arguments. You're always going to have the "that's not heavy metal" argument, no matter what. Somebody's going to say Slayer's not heavy metal. I mean, probably not, but people do like to be argumentative about these things.
Yes. Every genre has its gatekeepers. Yes.
Yes. Heavy metal is no exception, I assure you.
So I mentioned, I came to metal a little later, so I have a clear memory of my gateway to entry, which was Metallica's Black Album. You said you've been at it for a while. Do you have a memory of your first heavy metal album?
Oh gosh. Yeah, so mine's a little bit more embarrassing. Okay. So I was in 5th grade. I was pretty young. I believe at the time my favorite song was Belinda Carlisle's "Heaven Is a Place on Earth." But this was the same time that Def Leppard's "Hysteria" came out. Mm-hmm. And you talk about gatekeepers, and that's not heavy metal. I mean, Def Leppard, who I think are really an important part, certainly High and Dry and Pyromania in the early 80s. These are to me, distinctively pop metal records. Hysteria starts to really shift out of pop metal and into just sort of pop territory. But for a 5th grader who was listening to Belinda Carlisle, songs from that album, Animal or Rocket or whatever. These songs bands were metal. They looked, they had long hair, they wore ripped jeans and shirts and all that. And so bands, my gateway bands to heavy metal, call them heavy metal or call them just gateways. My gateway drugs were Def Leppard and Bon Jovi, frankly. Slippery When Wet and Hysteria were really the two earliest albums that sort of got me on the pathway that eventually is going to lead to me, listening to all sorts of just like wildly satanic death metal and things like that. But I still like. I'm a little off of Hysteria, but I still like Def Leppard. I still love a lot of Bon Jovi. I am very much steeped in pop metal, and that was how I came to it. Pop metal, and then the more glam side of that. That was where I began, and so I hold those bands near and dear to my heart still, and accept them within the heavy metal fold and all that.
All right, it's our last section. Time for our last section, and this is where we'll kind of mutually participate here. I know you have top 15, top 20, top 50. You've got a big list of albums, but I decided for the sake of time, let's just kind of briefly offer 5 each. And one thing is I'll give one, then you give one. We'll just kind of go back and forth, and just 5 albums that are not necessarily, might be important for the genre, but it's just ones that we love and we just want to recommend. So like, I'm going to start with the one that I know we have in common, because I know you've got 5 others you can choose, and that is Queensryche, Operation Mindcrime.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that's great about that is, first of all, it's a concept album, so there's an overlying story that connects all of the songs. It's quite dystopian.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the tracks that I love are Speak.
So good. So good. Love that one.
Great song called Spreading the Disease.
Another fabulous. That's a banger.
It ends with Electric Requiem and Breaking the Silence. Actually, Electric Requiem comes before Spreading the Silence, I believe. So I can't remember the order of. I didn't know that, but to me, right in the middle is the crown jewel, Sweet Sister Mary.
Oh yeah, well, as a prog dude, I could definitely see where that would be a big one. I will say that the final song is "Eyes of a Stranger," actually, on Operation Mindcrime.
Right. I will confess, I did not re-listen to these.
I listen to that album every day. I mean, how could you not?
That's true. All right, so give us one. What is one of your top 5?
Okay, I will give you the big thumbs up for Operation Mindcrime. It's a fabulous album. So I as you alluded to, I went chronologically, which may have been a mistake because I ended up with a list of like 72 albums. But to begin with, my first album, good old Black Sabbath. I've already actually mentioned it. Sabotage. It's kind of the last. It's the 6th of the classic, the original lineup before the drugs overwhelmed, I think, in the later 70s. Sabotage is just an incredible masterpiece. It's really transcendent. It marks, to my mind, the birth of very early, 1975, the birth of thrash metal, Symptom of the Universe, which is just as cool, as fast and rocking and chugging a song as you can possibly imagine.
Take me through the centuries to supersonic years, electrifying enemies.
It's also got these 2 epics, which are, again, I think that we talk progressive, especially Megalomania is Black Sabbath at their most progressive. It's got this like really ambient opening with Ozzy using this crazy like sort of reverse reverby entrance effect. I don't know what exactly they're doing to his voice, but it's so cool. And then it's just got a really awesome sort of groovy classic rock middle section. It's a great tune. I love it. And then finally, The Writ, which is the last track. The thing I would say collectively about Sabotage is Ozzy Osbourne is an icon, but he's not known necessarily as the greatest singer.
Yeah.
On Sabotage in all, and especially on The Writ, it's one of the great vocal performances of all time. He is at the very top of his range. He's so angry. It's a song about lawyers and sort of the legal situation that Black Sabbath was in. Ozzy's vocal on The Writ is one of the great moments in heavy metal. It's just, whoo!
You know, Ozzy Osbourne has a voice that you don't have to hear very often to instantly recognize it every time you hear it. But, you know, one thing I find that is interesting about it is, like, I've never heard his natural voice. Every single song I've ever heard of him in, he's doing a double track effect.
Oh, yeah, that's so intrinsic to the Ozzy thing. I mean, you know, I saw Ozzy live, and it sounded great. It sounded cool. He sounded good. You know, I don't know. I don't think there was any double tracking at the time. You know, I saw him way back on the No More Tours tour in the '90s. I don't know that there was any double tracking going on, but yeah, it's definitely, you know, it's like Phil Collins or something. There's some people whose voices, John Lennon, you know, that double tracking is just kind of intrinsic to the way we know their voices.
All right, my second that I'm going to offer was the third heavy metal album I ever heard, but it was the first one where I said, I really like this. And that was Megadeth Countdown to Extinction.
It's our argument track.
And I love the title track. The song that I was told to try first was Sweating Bullets. And you know, it has almost kind of like a James Bond type chord progression going on. Symphony of Destruction, and of course, actually on guitar learned how to play Foreclosure of a Dream. It's actually one of the few I can still pick up and play the opening acoustic number for that. One of the things that attracted me to Megadeth is, and I don't know, there may be people who are like, what's wrong with you when I say this? Because I don't think this was intended, but Dave Mustaine, I love his voice because it's not only great, but it's funny. It's almost like it's a parody of a heavy metal vocalist. At the same time, it's a genuine heavy metal vocalist. And, you know,
see that?
Right now, as we're recording this, well, I guess just before we recorded this, the musical Beetlejuice was at the Tanger Center in Greensboro. And the guy who did that on Broadway, the title character, reminds me of Dave Mustaine. And I was just smiling as I was listening to the cast recording.
Folks, begging your pardon. Excuse me. Sorry to barge in. Now let's skip the tears and start on the whole, you know, being dead thing. You're doomed. Enjoy the singing. The sword.
Wow, that's really funny. Yeah, Dave Mustaine's voice, it's definitely an acquired taste, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's Dave Mustaine's voice. I mean, Megadeth isn't Megadeth without that vocal, that sort of nasal. And I agree, it carries irony really effectively. I think that's something he does. I mean, so my context, of course, is wildly different. You know, I first came to thrash metal through Megadeth's So Far, So Good, So What, which is 1988. And so even before And Justice for All, actually, by Metallica. And so I was a Megadeth guy. Megadeth that was my thrash band, and I liked Metallica, but I was really a Megadeth guy. And then Rust in Peace came out in 1990, and that was everybody's, you know, favorite thrash metal album ever. It was just this monumental, virtuosic magnum opus. And then when Countdown to Extinction came out with the lead single called Symphony of Destruction, you know, I just have this distinct memory of a friend of mine saying, like, you know, I thought it was going to be a symphony. I thought it was going to be this wildly elaborate Megadeth piece. And it's just this like pop song with like an AC/DC riff. And like, I have just never been able to get into that album. I do like a lot, unlike Metallica, who lose me certainly after the Black Album. There's a lot of sort of 90s and particularly, early 20th century, 21st century Megadeth I like, but I don't like that album very much.
Well, as I said, we're in big picture agreement, small picture sometimes not.
There we go.
Okay, so now was that your Megadeth choice, or what's your second choice?
Okay, my second choice. I thought about that. I did think about that. But, if I have to pick one thrash metal album, it's Rain and Blood. It's definitely Slayer's Rain and Blood. I am fundamentally more about the visceral attack of Slayer than I am about the elaborate virtuosity of Megadeth in this, thrash context.
Right.
And Rain and Blood is 29 minutes long. It is perfect. Rick Rubin, love him or hate him, he produced the perfect thrash metal album. One of the things I think about are the bookends of this album, which are by far the two longest songs. Angel of Death at the opening, which has one of the great Tom Araya screams. Open it up, and then Raining Blood, which is the sort of atmospheric, doomy closer. I mean, and everything in between is just like rip your face off, mosh pit, thrash perfection. I love it. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. I listen to it, really quite regularly. It's a great jogging album. So yes, Rain and Blood by Slayer.
Okay. All right. So my third one, I guess I'm kind of going chronologically to an extent, but not really. I'm staying in ones that I discovered before I was an adult, and I mean, before I graduated college, which, I should still say qualify. Yeah. Before I was an adult.
I'm going to mostly do that too. I'm only taking one later one.
Persistence of Time by Anthrax. So I know it's not the Anthrax album, it's like, like this was actually a follow-up to a more kind of main, one that's kind of stood the test of time a little bit, but, the Persistence of Time, it was the second Anthrax album I came across. The first one was something about Attack of the Killer Bees, I believe.
Oh yeah, well that's a funny one.
And
B-side collection, and
that was the first time I heard like the second part of "I'm the Man," which
yes, "I'm the Man" is iconic.
And then this is labeled as a clean episode, so I won't say what it stands for, but the last track's called NFB. Nice effing ballad, basically, which has the funniest ending of any song. This time forever, true love prevails over all. She got hit by a truck. But
Anthrax are a funny band.
I assumed that Anthrax was just this comedic band, and and then Persistence of Time, and they have to at least match the fastest tempo of any song. It's like what they do with like Got the Time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's got to be over 200 beats a minute. It's just really fast. And then and then Into My World is just one of those songs I can put on repeat. And there are some other tracks I did not revisit it, recent enough to say the ones that I really like, but those are the two tracks that I could instantly recall. So that's my third choice, Anthrax, Persistence of Time.
Great band, really, really, really cool band. Part of the Big Four, the Big Four thrash bands. And it's not my favorite Anthrax album by any stretch, but yeah, I mean, it's classic Anthrax. And Anthrax are another band that in the 21st century have done some really cool stuff. If you haven't checked out on them in a little while, they're kicking booty.
Yeah.
But okay, so this is a personal list. I had to go with my personal hero, or at least one of my personal heroes, the great King Diamond. I needed to choose a King Diamond album. It's like choosing a child for me. I am a huge King Diamond fan. I'm a big Merciful Fate fan as well, which is the band from whence he came. I went conservative. I decided to choose the classic King Diamond album, the one that's on all the lists is the best. That would be Abigail. Abigail is the second album after King Diamond left Merciful Fate and went solo. It is the first, or it's not really solo, it's really a band called King Diamond. But anyway, I digress. It is the first album that starts a template for King Diamond that is horror concept albums. So like Operation Mindcrime, we've got a concept album here, but it's specifically horror themed. It's all about, a dark and stormy night in a mansion and like ghosts. And, I don't want to get too into the narrative, but suffice to say, it really creates atmosphere. King Diamond is famous for wearing corpse paint, first off. He sort of is one of the people who establishes that template of wearing corpse paint that becomes important to black metal later. Famous also as a Satanist, I might add, a non-theistic Satanist. But these albums are really just about storytelling. And Abigail tells an amazing story. The song A Mansion in Darkness is really, if you want to just get into King Diamond, get into the atmosphere, get into sort of the virtuosity of the musicians, the great Andy LaRocque, the lead guitar player, King Diamond's voice, incredible stuff. And then another song to check out, The Seventh Day of July, 1777. It's got the real atmospheric sort of acoustic opening and filmic keyboards, and then just becomes like a shredding, like a really gothic traditional metal tune. I love King Diamond. I love all his albums, but you got to know Abigail. I mean, it's essential.
Right. So for my a little bit of context before I give my fourth one. So I did not listen to any new heavy metal from probably 1997 to at least 2010, and a lot of it had to do with I'm an adult now, and I've now got to pay my own bills, and I'm going to go buy albums and so forth. So this is where the invention of Spotify was really good. When I got into it, I didn't think, what have I missed on heavy metal? It took me I was probably about 2012 before I started really kind of exploring a lot of genres that I'd missed. And so it was really great discovery to come across Avenged Sevenfold, which was, I think kind of hearing you talk about it, I think that would be more of a pop metal, at least where they've become. And I tried a song, and it was called Shepherd of Fire. It's from her fifth album. And I heard low brass in it, and I was immediately hooked. So I listened to that. I really liked it. And I decided, when I like a band, I'm going to go back to the beginning and try what, and I did not like their first two albums. This first album especially, they were doing I do have a problem aesthetically with the screamy, distorted, growly voice.
The dirty vocal is not your thing.
It's not. No, I have to really, really like everything else to overcome it. But so it was kind of hard for me. But then the lead vocalist, he kind of changes to where it's a distorted quality he does that's on the verge of screaming, but it still has a lot of clean in it. And I love that sound. But their self-titled album, which is really their fourth album, is known as the White Album. There's a song called Afterlife, which is great. It's I think the second track, but there's a song called Unbound, Wild Ride, which has, it truly is these arpeggios going up and down.
Somewhere life is good and things go as they should. It's hard to find, but that's alright. Yeah.
And then for some reason it ends with a children's choir
Why not?
at the end, but which, sometimes I'm in the mood for that part and sometimes not. There's a great ballad on there called Dear God. I think heavy metal fans are not supposed to admit this, but I do love good ballads.
I like a good ballad myself. Don't like a bad ballad, but I do like a good ballad.
We all need the person who can be true to you. I left her when I found her, and now I wish to stay.
Yeah, Avenged Sevenfold. I mean, they're huge. They're like like you said, sort of the modern equivalent to pop metal, and to, as extreme metal from the '90s sort of changed the paradigm a little bit. They're a lot heavier than Bon Jovi was when they get heavy.
They're coming to Charlotte in June, but I don't have a budget for any more. I saw Muse in March, and that kind of like. That was my budget for the year.
Yeah, I mostly either do club shows of like really cool bands that are playing affordably, or if Judas Priest comes, I'll go see them. But the big expensive big ticket items are complicated. Avenged Sevenfold is not a band that I listen to a lot. They're not just not quite my aesthetic of choice. I'm definitely more of the 21st century metal, more on the late, the death metal and the black metal and the post black metal and things like that. But they're a band of clear quality. I mean, they do nice stuff. I think that's a very solid choice.
Okay, what's your fourth choice?
Okay, so I couldn't not do a Judas Priest album,
right.
Because Judas Priest, the metal gods. This is not controversial, but it is a distinctive choice. I went with their 1990 album, actually, where they basically showed all those young upstart thrash metal bands how to do it. And that would be Painkiller, which is by far, at least until their 21st century stuff, unquestionably by far their heaviest album. It is just absolutely blistering. It had the title to me, the title track, Painkiller, is the platonic ideal for a heavy metal song. It is as good as it gets, just incredible bombastic drumming. It's got a killer riff that uses, amongst other things, the tritone. It's actually a kind of a Locrian riff, which is kind of cool, the flat 2 and the flat 5. But Rob Halford's vocals are shrieked. They're at the highest part of his range, but it's pitched. It's wholly pitched, and just incredibly virtuosic. And there's a bunch of guitar solos, and they're all just completely shredding virtuosity. It is so good, so good. If you're going to listen to one heavy metal song ever, I might suggest Painkiller be the one. See what you think. Also on that, that album, I love that Painkiller goes into the second track, which is Hell Patrol, which is this epic, sort of powerful, almost doomy, like a sort of Iron Maiden meets Doom. It's just so good, going from one banger to the next banger. And also a special shout out to the song A Touch of Evil, which is kind of that album's ballad. I mean, it's not a ballad in the conventional sense, but it is sort of slow and keyboardy. And it's got preposterously incredible vocals, particularly on the bridge. Trust me, check that out. Just so good. Painkiller was actually my first Judas Priest album, and I don't think it's my favorite as an adult necessarily, but gosh, it's good. It's really, really good.
Great. Well, the last one that I'll mention, and it's by a band that you mentioned in our pre-planning for this episode, and I did listen to the album. I think it's called Imaginarium, but the band is Nightwish, and my introduction to them is still one of my all-time favorite metal albums, and it's called Dark Passion Play. And the opening track is a 13-minute symphony, basically. It's the poet and the pendulum, and it uses like not just the orchestra. Sometimes you hear orchestra mixed with rock tunes, and it's like some strings, some nice chords. This is like virtuosic stuff happening, in all the sections of the orchestra, mixed in with, you've got a female lead vocalist, but you also have, some guys that sing as well, and it's I'm not sure, what is their country of origin? They're
Finland.
They're
They're Finnish.
I knew they were Scandinavian. So you've got some of their folklore in their music. The song that really got my attention was "The Islander," which, again, talk about a nice ballad. This is, it sounds like a folk song, basically, and it's got you really enter the Gaelic pipes. And then another song I really loved on it was 7 Days to the Wolves.
Yeah, Nightwish are great. They're symphonic metal in general is a sub or an adjective. I don't know if it's more of an adjective than a subgenre, but symphonic power metal is something that is not really in my wheelhouse, but I think Nightwish do it the best probably of anyone who does it. I really like the sort of female singing on top of and the diversity of having this occasionally sort of growled male singing at the same time. And yeah, their orchestrations are beautiful. I mean, they write some very, very pretty stuff. Imaginarium, which is the next album actually after that, I believe it's 2011, is one of my favorite. I mean, there's things I don't like on it, right. But the things I like, I just adore. Like, is some of my favorite music making. So yeah, good. All
right, your final choice, sir.
All right, so for my final choice, I the adult Eric comes through. One of my deep dives during the COVID era was a band that I was familiar with, a band that I always liked, but never really embraced as a kid. And that would be a band I've mentioned a few times, Death, led by, again, one of my real heroes, Chuck Schuldiner, rest in peace. Death is a band that is one of the founding voices of sort of the Florida death metal scene of the late 80s. And in 1998, they released their final album, The Sound of Perseverance. And oh my gosh, the thing, I think the important context here is that Chuck had established sort of the paradigm of death metal. He very quickly, I don't want to say evolved, but he very quickly sort of grew to embrace lots of other sounds, including progressive sounds and things that are not conventionally associated with death metal. And by this time, he was really ready to stop playing death metal. He actually started, or was in the process of starting, a new band called Control Deny that's more of a power metal project. And he signed to a new label that wanted one more death album. They said, like, we'll sign you, but you got to do one more death album. And so that's where The Sound of Perseverance comes from. And they basically reworked some of the songs that they were working on for this power metal project into death metal. Chuck takes on this vocal persona that is pretty wholly different. It is dirty, but it's shrieked dirty vocals instead of growled dirty vocals. And it is just the virtuosity on this album, the song structures, the anthemic accessibility that just sort of crops up. Spirit Crusher, one of my favorite songs of all time. I just saw a death tribute band comprised of former members do a performance, and when they played Spirit Crusher is one of the great moments of my life. It has this riff, this Iron Man-esque riff in it that just is so, it moves mountains. It's really amazing. For people who don't like death metal, and there are many of those people I know, one of the great sort of heavy metal instrumentals, beautiful sort of balladic instrumentals, voice of the soul. A cover of the great Judas Priest's Painkiller. And it is I mentioned that as my idea of the Platonic ideal. And how do you match the Platonic ideal? I don't think there's any band in the world besides Death that could go toe to toe with Judas Priest on Painkiller. And Chuck Schuldiner, a death metal vocalist who's really more of a songwriter and guitarist, shrieking death metal style, goes toe to toe with Rob Halford, with probably my vote for the best death metal vocal performance of all time on his iteration of Painkiller. They do all new guitar solos, which are equally virtuosic, if not more so. It's just like it's just. It is, in my opinion, quite possibly the greatest heavy metal album of all time. It's an album that I really didn't discover until, a few years ago. I listened to it. It's on constant background play in my playlist. It's so great. And if you don't know the band Death and you want to explore heavier heavy metal, they're as good as it gets. They're the Beatles of death metal.
That'll probably be a clip.
Yeah, nice.
Well, I know we've gone long, but we're talking about an entire genre that's been around for 50 years, over 50 years, and
standing the test of time.
Yes, so very hard. So for more details on this, obviously I will send people to your podcast, which is Heavy Metal 101. Now, I know when you started, you were Spotify only. Is that still the case?
That is no longer the case. Yeah. So we started Spotify only because I really wanted to legally use entire tracks, and I don't have the funding to afford licensing those tracks. And I'm one of those very ethical music director types that doesn't like to, violate copyright laws. Yeah. So I started Spotify only, and then I just realized, there's better ways to do this. So the podcast now exists on Spotify in a format that includes music, and everywhere else, including on Spotify, frankly, you can listen to the podcast, and basically we have links in the show notes to the artist published version of the song on YouTube under discussion, and so you still can listen to the music. It just involves one more step. But yeah, the podcast is available literally everywhere that podcasts are available now. That would be, as you said, Heavy Metal 101.
And if you're interested in podcasting, so we have kind of you and I have two different kind of models for music. Like this episode will have music, but it'll have 10 to 15 second clips, basically just because we're discussing the tracks, the Fair Use Act allows me to do that.
Amen.
But you use Spotify, what they allow to link to the entire track. So it's you can actually go hear the whole thing. Well, actually, in the episode, we get to hear the whole track.
Yeah, it's embedded. It's a really nice little feature. Of course, it doesn't transfer outside of Spotify, which is hugely annoying. But yeah. So it is nice. It just flows sort of organically into the track with all the licensing taken care of and all of that. So that is a nice thing. But on my podcast, I get to use all sorts of little blippies and bloopies that are copyright free from the internet to create soundscapes and sort of play. I try and play, as much as it's an educational and entertainment podcast, I try and play with the format artistically through the use of sound and composition and things like that.
So definitely check that out. And listeners, before we say goodbye, listeners, if you are into heavy metal, what are some of your favorites? Or if you listen to this episode and you try something, what was something that you really liked? You can send me a message. You can also go to speakpipe.com/Musician Toolkit and leave a voice message, and I'll include it on a future episode of the podcast. So we reached the end of this epic look at heavy metal, but again, everyone should go check out Heavy Metal 101
Oh
for
yeah, we go deep.
for a deeper dive into all of these things, and start at the beginning, because you do give a little bit of prehistory, which we really didn't get too much into. But so Eric, I know you now have to put on your professor hat and go, do some collegiate stuff. So
I got to accompany. I got to teach the young minds. I'm not going to talk too much about heavy metal, sadly, which is just very unfortunate.
Yes. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk heavy metal.
And that wraps up our 2-part conversation with heavy metal, and also episode number 25. Whether you're choosing to listen to this as a podcast or you're following along watching on YouTube, I want to say thank you and appreciate it if you would subscribe and follow wherever you are. And if you are watching us on YouTube, it'd be so helpful if you would give us a thumbs up and even leave a comment if you enjoyed this episode. And let us know and especially if you're a heavy metal fan, what's your favorite band, what's your favorite album, or what's your favorite song. Also, let me know, did this episode give you an appreciation for the genre that you didn't have already? Last request, if you enjoyed this episode and you know somebody else who would appreciate it, we would love it if you would share this episode with at least one other person. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back next week.